First and foremost, welcome to the Spokes 2021 keynote session. My name is Stephen Bucco. I'm the Senior Director of Professional Services here at WireWheel, and it's a pleasure to be your host for today. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items before we begin. I'd like to ask that you ask a question using the discussion. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom toolbar. We'll get to as many as we can. You're also asked to interact with other attendees through the chat feature here on the Zoom platform. Okay. For IAPP credit members, you can get CP credit if you download the CP credit certification in the attendee portal. All right. Now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for our session today, Justin Antoni-Pillay, CEO of WireWheel. Justin, please take it away.
Stephen, thanks so much. And thank you all for joining us here today for our Spokes Global Conference, day one. And I'm very proud of what our entire WireWheel team has brought to the community. And I have to say, speaking on behalf of myself, I'm just looking at the list of friends and community members that are here today. I love seeing you all virtually, sitting on my Zoom desktop as a name. But we're also excited to bring Spokes to the next level in the next year. So as we move this event forward, we are excited to announce that we're going to be having in the next year live Spokes events, live Spokes member communities, so that we can actually catch up in person as we move out of this COVID world. So love seeing everybody today. I hope you will take the chance to participate in all of our sessions, to ask questions. Sitting on this side of the camera, the more questions we get and engagement, the better for all of us. And just to give you a preview of some of the sessions we're bringing you today, we had a phenomenal set of opening early morning sessions here with Tara Antoni-Pillay. I'm quite biased, I will tell you, founder of Cultivate, who put together a session on well-being strategies for returning to the office. And it was great to see so many of you there early this morning for that session. We've added a line to Spokes of core technical briefings. And we had a terrific session this morning led by Khaled LMN and Mike Hintz on synthetic data. Another one of those areas that has a great chance to lift our product development and our community, but there is a lot of technical background and understanding that our panelists covered this morning. Soon, we're going to have Simon McDougall here from the UK ICO's office for an armchair discussion on some of the developments from Europe. And as you know, Simon's been leading the Technology and Policy Innovation Office in the Information Commissioner's Office. Very, very closely aligned with a lot of our subjects here at Spokes, and I'm looking forward to that discussion here today. At 12:30 Eastern, we have our Privacy Leaders panel, covering a number of really, really hot topics, including how members of our community can actually bridge inside their companies to bring the right team members together and the right technologies. And we're going to cover that from, kind of a repeated pattern perspective for all of us. But we're also going to have our privacy leaders talking about the Supreme Court's decision last week in TransUnion, what it means for us, the movement of state laws around the country, and some of the latest developments on FTC authorities. We have another really interesting session starting at 1:30 today on implications of brain-computer interfaces and what that means to all of us. A really timely topic on dark patterns and privacy by design with Andy Dale, Sarah Barrows, and Pedro Pavone. It's going to be a terrific session. one of the most requested topics from all of you were on vaccine passports, and just an outstanding panel coming on at 3 o'clock today, Eastern. And then we're going to end day one with a panel on national security and privacy. Longtime members of our community, but folks who are going to bring a terrific perspective. Charlie Savage of the New York Times moderating, Travis LeBlanc of Cooley, who's of course also a P Club member, Glenn Gerstel from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also the former general counsel of NSA, and Bob Litt of Morrison and Forster, who was formerly general counsel of ODNI. And that's just day one. So a lot to cover in the next few days. Welcome back. Look forward to seeing everybody in person. And with that, I'd like to welcome to our stage Simon McDougall of the the UK ICO. Simon, welcome back. How are you doing?
Justin, thank you. I'm doing well. Thanks for the invite to come back. And like you said, I've just paged down the list of attendees as well. And it's lovely to see so many, I was going to say familiar faces, but right now they are familiar names. And it would be lovely for them to be familiar faces again. So it's great to be back with this community.
Well, Simon, look, thank you very much for having us. I too was looking, and I know you and I see a lot of our friends on this list. So I'm just going to start with a little bit about you, Simon. So you've been on the privacy side and a leader on the privacy community, counseling huge corporations all over the world. And then you had the chance to actually pivot and go into the regulatory side and join the UK Information Commissioner's Office. We're going to cover some of your substantive, papers and AI and other items, but I just thought I'd ask you a question for all of us. Like, what was it like? What was it like kind of coming in to the regulatory side, and maybe give us a little bit of a behind the scenes from your perspective?
Yes, it's a great question. But the first thing to say, Justin, is that it was fantastic. It was genuinely a wonderful experience, and it's been one of the best experiences of my professional career. So I've got 4 weeks left now, 4 weeks and a bit. And so I am starting to look back on the whole thing. I think it's really rewarding to be surrounded by so many other people who are passionate about privacy, data protection, people's information rights. One of the things that one of my team said to me, who had been a senior CPO in their previous role, is they're very often being the only person in their organization who really got this. And it's a real luxury to be surrounded by people who really get this all the time, because normally we have to come to events like this to be surrounded by people who really care about privacy and data protection. And so it's been a real luxury to be among people who are passionate and skilled and engaged on this. If I reflect on one of the key themes, one of the things I didn't necessarily expect from when I joined, it's just how I thought I knew how broad the remit of the UK Information Commissioner's Office was, because as you say, I'd worked with large corporates and data protection for 20 years. And I hadn't really appreciated actually for a modern data protection authority, especially the ICO has 10 different pieces of legislation it has responsibilities under, quite how broad the waterfront was. And quite how many organizations we would engage with and how many issues we would have, and obviously touching for the ICO on things like freedom of information and other pieces of regulation as well. And that was a real shock to me in the first few months, was quite how many issues, the sheer breadth of what we dealt with and how we had to prioritize on a day-to-day basis. But obviously that's part of the fun of the job as well.
Well, yeah, it is, and I'm a little bit able to sympathize with you, Simon. The similar observation I had was in the U.S. The U.S. Commerce Department is the leader on the commercial side for many privacy issues, but of course, The FTC is at the head of the pack for a lot of regulatory issues. DOJ, ODNI, Department of Homeland Security, the White House. So the thing that struck me just on an inside government view, which I don't know how this is handled on the UK side, Simon, but on the US side, one of my first experiences around privacy was going to a meeting after the Snowden disclosures years ago, in which there were different European countries calling for a suspension of safe harbor at the time. That was the context. But in the first meeting, intra-governmental, virtually every federal agency was represented. State Department, DOJ, ODNI, the intelligence community, Homeland Security, it was just everybody. And you realize that this particular internally at government really is very broad because it touches so many different agencies. Is that similar in the UK instance? I know you have obviously the UK Information Commissioner's Office is independent and has that role, which here in the US side we don't have. But do other offices on the UK side get involved?
They do, and you're right to highlight, Justin, the gap there is there. The ISO is independent, it's arm's length. The bulk of its income also comes from data protection fee from UK data protection data controllers. So in that regard, whilst it does get some funding for some other activities, including freedom of information, the main funding and the main activity of data protection regulation is all funded through fees. So it is substantially more independent and distant as an entity. But that said, we had to work very actively with government on a number of levels. So we have a Department of Culture and Media supported our sponsor department, and we answer to the DCMS Select Committee, so a committee of parliamentarians, and so there's that dynamic. And then also within the COVID pandemic, and I've been the responsible executive at the ICO for all of our COVID response, we've had to work very fluidly with parts of government as real-time issues have come up about how data can be used during the pandemic, sharing of health data, sharing of data on vulnerable people. You mentioned vaccine passports. There's a very live discussion in the UK right now, contact tracing and the app and the like. On all those areas, we've had to be very engaged with different departments. So it is a very multi-leveled conversation. There is probably a kernel of independence there, because in the end, both under the Data Protection Act and UK GDPR and under Freedom of Information, we regulate government, so there's that distance. And at the same time, they're some of the biggest data controllers in the UK, and so we just have to interact with them as data controllers as well.
Well, yeah, and that's a great sort of segue. So, as somebody who came in from the private sector to government, I learned a lot personally about how to interact with your regulators and what matters, what is harder for the regulators to hear, and or what's less effective. Just in the last year, given your role at the UK ICO around innovation, I assume you were brought into all kinds of subjects, vaccine passports and others, because it was such a fast moving, circumstance. I remember taking away a few things from watching really terrific folks come in and present to the agencies. Were there things you learned or that you can share with folks here? What did you learn about, what's effective, what actually helps when you're interacting? Should you even interact with your regulator? I mean, these are questions, on the outside are hard when you're not on the inside.
It's an area that, I've learned so much about this in the last couple of years, and I'll come back to COVID in a second, but in general, I think it's really important to put yourself in the shoes of a regulator, and the UK ICO is one of the best resourced data protection authorities in the world. So it's a really nice position to be in that respect. We have more headcount and more funding than many other equivalent regulators. That's great. And even so, one of the things that really struck me when I first joined the ICO is quite how much that broad waterfront I mentioned means there's an ongoing fight for prioritization and attention and time. And one dynamic I saw again and again, a piece of advice I have for everybody here is to keep in mind that with all due respect, and this is going to sound a little bit rude, I do apologize, even if you are, one of the top 3 or the biggest organization in your sector, and you are quite rightly the biggest fish in your pond, when you go to a whole economy regulator like the ICO, we're not the only one of these, but one of these horizontal regulators, there are many, many sectors. And so just because you are a very large retailer or a very large retail bank, even a very large technology company, although the biggest technology companies almost have, actually kind of break free of this by the weight of their processing. You are still only one of many companies trying to engage with the ICO. And so less so now, I think the message has got out there, but sometimes we would end up having a conversation with a big corporate where really all they wanted to tell us was they cared. They cared about this, and they wanted to show us some slides to show us how they did things and that they cared. And sometimes being cynical, they probably wanted to be able to go back to their bosses and say, oh, I've met with the regulator, and so we've ticked that box on my end of year appraisal, it's all good. And really, from our point of view, if you're a big corporate and you should be doing these things anyway, these are table stakes, and we don't really need to know how you've set yourselves up and how you're managing your 3 lines of defense or your enterprise risk management system, or here's your policy. If you're doing something terribly innovative, there's ways we engage with that, such as the sandbox. And if you're doing something which is especially risky, we have data protection impact assessments. If you're doing something which is wrong, you should come and tell us, and there's another channel for that. But if you're just trying to do the right thing as the good corporate citizens you are, then often formal engagement isn't going to get you very far, because you're basically talking to a regulator who's pretty busy and you're taking their time away from something else. Better to wait until you might catch them in a conference at a bar and you can tell them over a drink when they're a bit more relaxed, or wait until something which is truly new to discuss and then come and have the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting insight, and I understand, and I agree. There's a lot going on when you're actually in the seat from a lot of different sectors. One of the things I took away is specificity in a concern that's meaningful actually resonates. Sometimes I remember a company coming in and saying, or a representative or somebody, this particular provision doesn't work the way you think it might work, or it may have some collateral consequences that you may not have realized. Those meetings, everybody pushes their computer away and they listen, because unexpected consequences or something that they're not predicting, I found the regulatory community really cares about. And I mean across the board. We used to hear all the time on the US side that it was difficult to deal with I'll just say some specific European regulator. But when the company showed up or the representative, and they had a specific credible point that people may not have realized that affected one group unfairly or may affect the data subjects in a way that they hadn't realized,
yeah.
Boy, do they pay attention. On the other hand, if you show up and you say, this is going to be expensive for us, we really think this is going to be a burden, it literally, everybody shuts down as far as I can tell. It really, but it was that stark in my view, in terms of
Well, I think the latter point varies between regulators. I think maybe the ICO is more interested in whether something is a burden for business than some other regulators. And that's not to say that other regulators don't care when we do, but we've got some obligations in our framework to consider economic growth and other concerns, and B, we're always interested in understanding the impact of regulation in the real world. And Sometimes, absolutely, especially if it's a very large firm that's making good money after the data processing they're doing, and they say it's a bit tough over here. Well, here's the world's smallest violin. You know, you're in this business. This is how it works. But if someone says, actually, this is affecting lots of organizations and it could be done better, and especially if maybe it's affecting small and medium-sized enterprises or startups or scale-ups, and it's affecting the ability of UK firms to innovate and grow, we do have an interest in that. But I completely agree with you. All regulators, I think, are always thirsty for insight into what's affecting people in the real world. And there's that great XKCD comic where the little stick person says something like, "Oh my gosh, you never guessed, people are complicated," and people are complicated. And if somebody comes in and says, you know, we've got this population of people, and what you are doing here or what we are doing there means there is this outcome, we don't have a crystal ball. And so it's really interesting to understand what's affecting individuals. So I wouldn't completely discount the concerns of business, but that's obviously got to be a kind of a bit of a balancing test. When if you come in and say, actually, here's some insights on people that, you know, in your jurisdiction, in your scope, then we're all ears.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, a really good point. It also matters how big a company you are. You know, I did find some companies that were smaller that are talking about the burden. It tends to resonate more startups and other companies. Mm-hmm. Well, and so, you know, and before we go on to some of the other subjects, Simon, so what are you doing next? Are you able to share with us where you're going now?
I can share, but it's not a very exciting answer. So I finish end of July, and I am just going to have some time off. So I've never done it before in my career, and I'm going to spend a few months just with my family, with friends, catch up on a few things, probably write a couple of little articles and papers on the way, but really have a bit of a gap. My next move, which was always going to be the case, going back into the private sector, I want to do some time in public service and move back, but I'm going to worry about them more in the fall. And in the meantime, I think we've all missed, as we were talking about at the start of this, we've all missed seeing people in real life. In the UK, we're just starting to be able to see family and friends and contacts again. So yeah, I'm going just to spend a little bit of time doing that. And I'm hoping you'll see me resurface somewhere, TBC, and generally TBC, I'm not being coy, Justin, I've got no idea what I do, but I'll resurface sometime in the new year.
Wow, that was a perfect regulatory, administrative, executive director answer, and I'll let you off the hook on that one so far.
I promise you, there's no secret plan.
All right, so of course, I wanted to chat just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, on a couple of subjects that are, I think, very important to the community. The first, of course, is there are now 2 adequacy findings from the Commission with respect to the UK. Obviously, I know I'm not going to put you on the spot to sort of talk behind the scenes. You can't share very much, and so I'm not going to try to go into the making of the adequacy decisions, as they say, Simon, but would you mind giving just the community a little bit of context of what this means and how important this is from your perspective?
I think it's incredibly important. One of the things I've been doing the last few months, last few weeks really, is a bit of a end of term listening tour. I've been going to the stakeholders and talking to them about, you know, how the IT has been doing, what else we should be doing, getting feedback. And it's been striking how many organizations have said adequacy is by far the most important thing. That's not surprising. Go back to, say, the 95 directive, and, you know, it was in Europe, is the free flow of data has always been, you know, one of the raison d'etre for the privacy and data protection regime. And it really was there as a driving force before the more rights-driven layer was put on top of it. And so to be able to actually still have free flow of data from Europe to the UK and not have to work through the various mechanisms, contractual clauses, BCRs, Shield, etc., that would otherwise, you know, that the rest of the world has to deal with. is a huge step forward. So getting that finally signed off is welcome for everybody, and it's going to make a huge practical difference to how the UK manages privacy and data protection going forward.
Yeah, it is an important, I think a lot of folks were watching that, Simon. I do think, my view is establishing open dialogues and establishing the ability to have free flow of data with the right protections is critically important. But it would have been enormously disruptive, especially between the UK and the EU at the moment, given the central role that the UK plays on so many parts of our infrastructure. I think it's a terrific step. We do have a national security panel coming later on with a number of folks who've worked on the US side, including Travis LeBlanc and Glenn Gerstel and Bob Litt, who was at the head of the line on the Privacy Shield negotiations. Nobody can really comment on this, but I would be interested in how the adequacy review of UK intelligence and data collection practices actually compared to the review of the EU with respect to the US, leading to things like Schrems. But I'm not going to put you on the spot for that. We'll give you a break and we'll move on to the next subject. And maybe I'll ask that panel a little bit about it later. If you do have anything you want to say about it, you can tell us. So then we're going to pivot over to, I'm sorry, go ahead, Simon.
No, it's only guys to keep going.
All right, next. Your office focuses really on innovation and some of the latest technologies that are coming up. That itself is an absolutely enormous portfolio. If you think about everything from AI to the advent of quantum computing, which is a very significant step increase in processing that is likely to affect encryption in a lot of our communities. You may have seen that IonQ is really a company that's been productizing and releasing quantum processing pretty quickly. And you go to different kinds of privacy protected data sharing technologies. You had a huge portfolio over the last couple of years, but you had a pretty significant focus on AI, including some recent reports. I'm just going to turn it over to you. From your role, what are some of the key insights you've really seen that you think affect, and of course, the recent release of some guidance from the EU on AI? Where do you think this is going from your perspective, on a regulatory perspective, on AI, machine learning, and where should this community be focused?
Well, when I started at the ICO, AI was not a new subject, but it was in some ways sort of buzzword. And obviously AI itself, which all conferences have been based on trying to define what AI is, but it's in terms of this wave of AI and advances in machine learning in particular, it's matured massively in the last couple of years. But I think it is almost getting to a stage now where we're reaching a tipping point between AI being a novel technology and AI just being another service and being almost ubiquitous. And there's a lovely phrase out there, which I'm going to mangle now, about AI is all the stuff we can't do yet, and as soon as it becomes something we can do, it becomes normalized, and people just go, okay, this is straightforward now. It's natural language processing, it's image recognition, it's facial recognition. It's not AI. So I do think maybe we're bizarrely maybe getting to the end of worrying about AI as a separate technology, because it's just applied stuff, and it's in the supply chain, it's being utilized in a widespread way, and we've just got to deal with it as part of the wider range of questions around algorithms, and in particular automated decision making. And when I think about actually what questions we worry about with AI, and when you read lots of articles about AI, to me, a lot of those questions are just standard data protection questions around lots of technology. And it's actually about the ubiquity of technology and the ubiquity of technology to make decisions about people. Some stuff is about algorithms which may or may not be AI, depending on how you define AI. But it doesn't necessarily have to. It can just be some macros on a spreadsheet for, if you really want. And then there's some particular things around AI, in particular around machine learning, which are unique questions to AI. Some questions around explainability and deep learning, for instance, and whether actually sometimes it's okay to have a trade-off with explainability, or whether actually that's always just a bad design choice. And there's some really interesting points to discuss there. But as I look at it now, Justin, I do wonder, compared to where we were a couple of years ago, how many unique questions there are about AI, and how much this just turns into how we feel about technology making automated decisions or predictions about people, and whether the actual AI discussion itself is reaching the end of a phase. And I think that's an open discussion. I haven't got a punchline on this, but I do wonder if over the next couple of years, the AI discussion is going to actually run out of steam a little bit, because AI will be being used everywhere, and what we care about really is just the broader questions around transparency, the old school questions: transparency, explainability, imbalances of power, personal autonomy, which sometimes involve AI, sometimes are just about other data processing.
My reaction is the same, Simon. I tend to see two different theories on AI. One is real understanding for the data subject or the consumer that they're subject to an automated decision. Just even yes, no, is that part of the line? Mm-hmm. And that's hard to communicate. It's hard to know for some organizations, and then it's hard to communicate. Simon, I do a walkthrough for folks pretty regularly where I VPN into a country in Europe just to show it. I put on a mode on the browser, and I just bring up the notices that are put forward to a human being when they go to do a search on a search engine. And right now, just the notices of the thing we do every day, it's usually between 5 and 7 paragraphs. And if you ask for more, it goes to a full page of information that very few people I know can humanly understand, even if they're trying. It's just not because the companies are doing something improper. I don't think it's that. It's just even explaining what is going on briefly, succinctly, in a way that a person can understand is really complex. I see this in the AdTech infrastructure at all. I see friends from the AdTech world on today. Understanding what's going on in your browser and in the AdTech world when you go to do something right now on a website is just complex. And trying to explain it simply is hard. So I think this is a very basic challenge with AI, which is even if you're bringing AI to the table or an automated decision and you're doing it and you try to tell the consumer you're doing it, it's really hard to make it something they're going to pay attention to, like really understand that that's happening, and to make it meaningful given all of the information and how quickly people interact with a device. And I think there's a lot to be said for that as an issue with AI. And even understanding it when you get into neural networks. I mean, we've been in briefings, they're very, very complex. So that's one of the two, and then I'll ask your reaction. The second major challenge we see really with AI is the real concern about bias and automated decisions. And in the US, obviously, that concept, bias and automated decisions, is covered under specific sectoral laws that prohibit bias for a whole bunch of specific areas, like mortgages or financial services, hiring. But there's not an overarching concept in the US of automated decision-making for every industry and implicit bias. So those are the two primary, sort of things I hear in a lot of different variation on AI. Is that kind of resonating with you on your side, and or are there others I'm missing?
It does. There are so many points wrapped up in those 2 points, Justin. Dealing with aversions is not a full answer because these are, again, big questions. One thing I think we've really got to grapple with, and it's partly a data protection question, in particular around what we would call in Europe special categories of data, but it is also a broader ethics question, and just a broader question full stop, is what the right approach is around processing sensitive special categories of data in order to address bias. So we cannot fool ourselves, as sometimes I think some organizations do, by thinking that we're achieving compliance by omission. Because we don't collect any data, direct data on race, sex, sexuality, yada, yada, therefore our data can't be biased. We all know that's nonsense, but there is obviously a naturally awareness out there, because many data protection regimes say this data itself, it has a special characteristic to it and has to be handled in a different way. But we haven't really, there are mechanisms in the GDPR and the like, but we haven't really collectively, I think, as a community said, okay, in essence, all data sets are biased, all processing is biased to an extent. Anyone who sits there and looks at you and says, oh, we've got no bias here, is fooling themselves. In the same way as anyone who says, we've never been hacked, is also fooling themselves. We know these things aren't true. So we have to just, the best we can do is work to mitigate the risk. And that involves, I think, having some visibility of the characteristics you're trying to protect. So that is, I think, one challenge we have. Going back to your first point, again, lots of points wrapped in there, but the one thing I would surface, I think, is that I increasingly am skeptical about the benefits of transparency to the general public. And that's not to say we should not have transparency, and individuals who want to have things explained to them should have things explained to them, and there should be disclosures around how their data is used. But such is both the complexity, but also the imbalance of power between a larger organization processing someone's experience and designing an online experience for the individual and that person themselves, that the onus has to lie on the organization, not on the individual. And so transparency is often used as a bit of a crutch. Well, buyer beware, we made our disclosures, therefore everything's okay. That doesn't work in this world of design architecture. It doesn't work in this world of people who are time limited. It doesn't work in the world of IoT as well, where it's hard to make those disclosures. That's a separate point. The onus has to be on accountability for the organization. And the way I think about it, Justin, is if you look at mature regulatory environments, say around food safety, financial services, etc., we don't sit there, if you get a new retail bank account and someone sits there and runs you through the operational security controls of the bank and how they run their KYC and the like, it's a regulated industry. If somebody goes in and buys some food in the supermarket, they don't need to sit there and check the whole supply chain and see where their beef burgers came from. They have faith in the regulatory framework that manages food safety. We're not there with information regulation yet. We still seem to put too much onus on the individual. We need to end up in a more mature space where the onus resides much more heavily on the accountable, what we would call data controller, rather than saying transparency is the way forward.
No, and honestly, given the disparity, I completely get it. It makes a lot of sense, and I think there are areas where a disclosure really doesn't cure anything. I mean, that's in fact true in a lot of regulated areas in the United States. You could disclose 50 times that I may be considering you for a mortgage, but I'm using automated decision. It doesn't discharge any of the duties. It still is hard. Like, some of these technologies are functionally mirroring the brain, really. And understanding whether that's automated or not, or how you're doing it, it starts to get very, very, very difficult. So anyway, I think this is a fascinating area. Are you able to comment at all? And I understand if you can't, on the proposal from the EU on AI.
Yeah, and that it's a really interesting first step. And one of the things it has achieved is I think beforehand people were talking about if AI regulation, and now people are often talking about, well, what would this regulation look like? It has shifted the tone of the discussion, I think, along the way. I do think that's worth keeping in mind. It's very early days. I remember the first draft the Commission put out in the GDPR all those years ago. I sat there and I highlighted every page and I started posting notes in and little comments and stuff. And I was wasting my time. I was wasting my time because there was such a saga afterwards in terms of the various processes through Parliament and Council, the trialogue, that the various bits of the sausage making machine that is legislation, that I think an awful lot of energy was spent in the middle of that. So this is clearly the beginning of a very long process, and we need to treat it as that, and there'll be lots of opportunities to have input along the way. Like I say, I do worry sometimes that, if we say AI regulation, we are clearly scratching an itch. There is clearly something there in automated decision making and how we interact with a much more algorithm-driven world. But focusing purely on AI as a thing, I think sometimes it feels like nailing jelly to a wall. We'll struggle with definitions if we always talk about AI regulation. But I think it's a really interesting step.
Well, yeah, Simon, I totally agree. So let me pause for a minute. First of all, as I mentioned, normally you all know in the audience that I would have everybody turn on their cameras and say hello. We're not allowed to do that on this one. So I can see friends though, and if you have questions for Simon that you'd like to have, please go ahead and post them to the Q&A. Simon, we have two that are posted, so I'm going to read them. Maybe we can address them as we go. One is, with respect to AI, what are those areas you think are, quote, a false concern versus those that are underappreciated concern? And then second, in your view, has the bar with respect to how organizations present transparency been raised during your tenure? Are these expectations increasing in your view in any way? Do you have any reactions to those?
Yes, so I'll again deal them backwards, I think. So in terms of whether the bar's gone up or down, I think overall we understand some aspects about transparency so much more now than we did 2.5 years ago. And it wasn't, I'd focus on the design architecture here. This is not as if this is already a discussion that was live, I appreciate, 2.5 years ago. I remember being part of some really interesting conversations prior to joining the ICO, but quite how it works. You've got a session on dark patterns later, and quite how one engages with different individuals and how and what they understand and what makes sense to engage them on has advanced hugely. We also understand a lot more, I think, often through trial and error and some challenges in our society and democracies. We understand more about how the engagement economy, has driven certain design choices and certain online experiences, and sometimes that hasn't been positive, either from a privacy and data protection point of view, but also from a societal point of view and from a democratic point of view. So I think that discussion has moved on massively. And if I think back to where we were, let's say 5 years ago or so, or maybe pre-GDPR, where a lot of my corporate conversations were around tick box privacy notices. There is still some of that, and people still have to get the right things into their privacy notices, absolutely. But I think there's much more of a dialogue in mature organizations, at least, between the people who understand the user journey and the people who are trying to actually, can make real comprehension and engagement and expectation management happen on that user journey. So overall, I'm an optimist. I do think the flip side of that is, I think as we uncover different stones and rocks in the way design works online, we sometimes find some behavioral worms we don't like. So I think there's sometimes the scales are falling from our eyes on how there are tricks of the trade. But hey, that's still progress, even if it's a bit disappointing. So it's overall optimistic about how we understand transparency online. In terms of AI, with underappreciated areas or false. So I mean, this is a well-worn discussion, but I haven't seen anything, as I've spoken with people far smarter than me, but people in AI who are far smarter than me, around fears. The whole kind of the fears around the singularity and around killer robots. Really, we've got more to worry about dumb AI right now than clever AI. So those are kind of false concerns. I think the things that are underappreciated, I'd focus on two things. Firstly, I have I think we need a proper discussion in the next few years about the value of human intervention in an automated decision. And that's not because I think that's not a useful control. I think sometimes it is, and sometimes it's very comforting to the general public and the user that that's in place. So I'm not saying scrap human intervention, and obviously in GDPR, UK GDPR, that's Article 22 of the line. But I do worry that a reliance on that just skips over the fact that humans are probably biased. And also, if you've got a human who's dealing with a whole stream of AI-driven decisions and they're saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, so, and the computer's telling them yes or no, and you just get humans rubber stamping stuff. And there's lots of behavioral things on that. So I have a bit of concern when someone says, well, it's okay because we've got a human in the loop. That doesn't make me any less concerned about that. That means you've just got another thing that's biased in your whole stream of bias. That's not actually looking at the whole thing and trying to address it. So that's one underappreciated area. The other thing is something I touched on before: supply chain. I think we often in the privacy world should look to the cyber world, which always seems to be in its maturity a few years ahead of us. And you look at the bulk of cyber breaches now, and it's normally to do with some kind of entry via the supply chain that into someone's network via some kind of supplier. But human nature is you focus on your most immediate things first, and you trust what your third parties are telling you. As we move into a world where much more data is processed by third parties on platforms using X, Y, Z as a service, whether it's AI or whether it's just anything else in the cloud, I don't think we are getting the weighting right between what our own in-house controls for many organizations and how much we're challenging our supply chain and seeing if others are meeting our standards. My gut feeling is we've got that a little bit out of whack. So supply chains and human intervention are areas I worry about with AI.
Those are really well taken points. For supply chain, you could make that case at a lot of levels too about a general risk to our organizations. One of the most requested subjects we're going to be bringing back, Simon, at our next Spokes is on ransomware. It's affecting, first of all, it's making a fair amount of headlines. A lot of them are not making the press. And if you're actually subject to that kind of an access, it affects the whole organization and certainly the privacy offices. So, and that's really a supply chain, challenge, really about access, understanding, and usage. Well, we're down to the last few minutes, Simon. You're getting some great compliments from attendees, folks here too, which is terrific. If there are any other questions folks have for Simon, please post them in the chat. As I'm wrapping up, we didn't get a chance to speak very much today, Simon. So just a moment or so. Are there any other privacy protective technologies or data sharing that you think the community should be paying attention to, or on the other side, maybe non-privacy protective technologies that have come to your attention that we all ought to be eyeballing in our own organizations?
So we're going to be carrying on working on this at the ICO. We're, as some people will know, it's on our website. We're already beginning to consult our anonymization guidance. But as we build on that, we're moving on to other privacy enhancing technologies. I think, to me, it's not really, I could reel off the ones that everyone knows, and you've already mentioned synthetic data, and you've got more encryption, federated learning, so on and so forth. It's the same list everyone has. I think, to me, the big question over the next couple of years with all of these technologies is which ones are commercially scalable, sufficiently fast, sufficiently resilient, practical, and they're going to become utilities that we just use along the way, and which ones are exotic beasts that never quite emerge out of the lab. Because it seems to me right now that there's really great companies doing really cool things with this portfolio of privacy enhancing technologies. It's come on a huge amount in the last couple of years, and yet very often it's still a struggle. Not always, I'm not saying that, but very often it's still a struggle to then get them working in an environment that means that you're actually using it in practice to realize value in a data set you couldn't realize before, or protect information in a different way, or enable access by a third party you couldn't do before. So it feels like we're on the cusp of some of these becoming mainstream, and in a way, as I say, perhaps with the aspect of AI where it becomes so mainstream no one really thinks about it anymore, and some others might become slightly, there's like dead ends, and we say, okay, that was really interesting if we could have done it, but we might need to wait another. As with AI, where they've got to a stage where basically some of the ideas had to wait for the technology to catch up. We need to get to a stage where we had a huge amount more data and a huge amount more processing power, and suddenly some aspects of machine learning are much more easy to realize. Some of those technologies may need to go and have a little sit down for a while, have a cup of tea, and then come back in 5 or 10 years' time, and then they'll be amazing. So that's my big question, not new technologies, but which ones are going to make it into being standard utilities that we're all using.
Simon, that's a perfect place for us to tie off today. I know we have a lot of questions, as I said, that were posted. We'll make sure, Simon, you get those from others. I really appreciate you joining all of us here today, Simon, for our opening keynote. I'm really hoping also that you're going to join us in person for another session when you're on this side of the regulatory line again. And thank you for all you've done for the community over the last few years. A lot of folks have noticed, and we're looking forward to having you back on the private sector side of the fence.
That's kind of you to say. Thanks, Justin, and hello and goodbye to everyone on the call. Looking forward to seeing everybody again sometime soon.
Thank you. And Stephen, maybe back to you to close the session and talk about our next one.